Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that weighs about 5 tons and hasn't moved in roughly 11,000 years, which, if you think about it, is not entirely inconsistent with how it behaved when it was alive. The giant ground sloth, and I realise that name alone sounds like something a committee invented to describe the least threatening animal imaginable, was one of the most extraordinary creatures to ever walk this planet. It was the size of an elephant. It had claws like curved swords. It reshaped entire continents, and then it vanished so thoroughly that most people, if they think of it at all, picture a slightly larger version of the thing hanging upside down in a rainforest canopy, moving at the speed of philosophical resignation. That is not what we are talking about tonight. What we are talking about is a dynasty, a lineage that endured for roughly 20 million years, survived ice ages and volcanic upheavals, and the rise and fall of predators that would make a saber-toothed cat look like a minor inconvenience, and then, within a geological heartbeat, ceased to exist entirely. If that does not strike you as one of the great mysteries of natural history, I would respectfully suggest you have not been paying attention. But that is why we are here, to pay attention, finally. Before we settle in, if you are new here, welcome. If you are returning, welcome back, and thank you for staying. Drop a comment, letting me know where you are listening from tonight. I am always curious. If you enjoy this kind of slow, deep, meditative content, consider subscribing, and if something in tonight's episode strikes you, a like goes a long way toward helping others find these stories. Now, dim the lights if you have not already. Turn on a fan if that is your preference, or a white noise machine, or simply let the quiet of wherever you are become part of the experience. What I am about to tell you is a story that stretches back 20 million years and ends, depending on how you measure endings, somewhere around 4,000 years ago. It is a story about an animal that was not dramatic, not fast, not flashy, and not, by any conventional measure, exciting. It was, however, profoundly successful, and its disappearance left a hole in the world that we are still, whether we realise it or not, living inside. Here is the argument I want to make tonight, and it is one that runs against the grain of how we usually talk about extinct animals. The giant ground sloth was not a failure. It was not a dead end. It was not some evolutionary experiment that nature tried and then quietly abandoned because the results were embarrassing. The giant ground sloth, across dozens of species, across 2 entire continents, across a span of deep time that dwarfs the entirety of human civilization by a factor that should make us uncomfortable, was one of the most successful large mammals the world has ever produced. It thrived in forests, grasslands, deserts, mountains, and islands. It shaped the plants that grew around it, the soil beneath it, and the landscapes it moved through. It was an ecosystem unto itself. And then, in the space of a few thousand years, a span so brief that the geological record can barely distinguish it from an instant, it was gone. All of it. Every species. Every population, every last individual. The giant ground sloth did not go quietly. It simply went, and the world barely noticed until the silence became permanent. That silence is what we are going to explore tonight. Not just what the ground sloth was, though we will spend considerable time on that because the animal deserves to be understood on its own terms before we mourn it, but also what it meant to the ecosystems it sustained, to the humans who encountered it, to the scientific minds that eventually unearthed its bones and tried to make sense of what they were holding. And finally, what its absence means now. Because the ground sloth has been gone for millennia, and the world is still adjusting. There are fruits on this planet, right now, tonight, that are waiting to be eaten by an animal that no longer exists. There are tunnels carved into bedrock by claws that turned to stone 10,000 years ago. There are gaps in forests, silences in seed dispersal networks, absences in ecological chains that trace back, link by link, to the moment the last ground sloth lay down and did not get up. Extinction, it turns out, is not an event. It is an echo, and if you listen carefully enough, which is what I am asking you to do tonight, you can still hear it. Chapter 1. What walked before us? There is a version of Earth that most people never fully picture, and it is not the one with dinosaurs. The dinosaur version is easy. Popular culture has been supplying that imagery for over a century, and at this point most of us can conjure a reasonably vivid mental landscape of the Mesozoic without much effort. Enormous reptiles, fern-choked swamps, volcanic horizons, the whole Jurassic production. But there is another version of Earth, far more recent and in many ways far stranger, that tends to slip through the cracks of public imagination. It is the Earth of the Pleistocene, and it was, by almost any measure, extraordinary. The Pleistocene epoch spans roughly from 2.6 million years ago to about 11,700 years ago, and for most of that vast stretch of time, the planet looked like something out of a fever dream, written jointly by a zoologist and a fantasy novelist who had agreed to collaborate but never quite coordinated their visions. This was a world of ice, enormous continental glaciers that advanced and retreated in slow, grinding cycles, reshaping coastlines, carving valleys, and locking up so much water that sea levels dropped by hundreds of feet, exposing land bridges and connecting continents that are now separated by ocean. But beyond the ice, beyond the tundra and the permafrost, the land was alive in ways that are almost difficult to credit. Consider what walked the Earth during the late Pleistocene, say around 50,000 years ago. In North America alone, you would have encountered Columbian mammoths standing 13 feet at the shoulder, their curved tusks sweeping outward like the prows of ships. American mastodons, stockier and more heavily built, moved through spruce forests with a patience that belied their enormous size. Saber-toothed cats, Smilodon fatalis, a name that sounds like a diagnosis, prowled the margins, their elongated canines designed not for chasing but for ambush, for a single, devastating bite delivered to prey that outweighed them several times over. Dire wolves, larger and more robust than any modern wolf, hunted in packs across grasslands that stretched from horizon to horizon. Short-faced bears, Arctodus simus, stood 6 feet at the shoulder on all fours and could likely reach 11 feet when rearing up an animal so large that modern grizzlies, which we already consider terrifyingly big, would have looked like adolescents beside it. Giant beavers the size of black bears. Glyptodonts, armoured herbivores that resembled Volkswagen Beetles wearing medieval plate armour trundled across South American plains, their domed shells impervious to nearly everything except, eventually, human ingenuity. Toxodon, a creature that looked like someone had tried to design a rhinoceros from memory and gotten several key details wrong. Terror birds in South America, though most had vanished by the late Pleistocene. Gomphithers, with their shovel-shaped lower jaws. The list is not short. The list, frankly, is almost absurd. And moving through all of this, unhurried and apparently unconcerned, were the ground sloths. To understand the ground sloth, you first have to understand the world it lived in, and that world was defined by scale. The Pleistocene was the age of megafauna, a term that technically refers to any animal exceeding 44 kilograms, or roughly 100 pounds, but that in practice tends to evoke the truly enormous, the multi-ton herbivores and the oversized predators that evolved alongside them. Nearly every continent had its own suite of megafauna during the Pleistocene. Africa had its elephants, its hippos, its giant buffalo. Eurasia had woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave bears, cave lions, and the enormous Irish elk with its 12-foot antler span. Australia had Diprotodon, a wombat relative the size of a hippopotamus, and Megalania, a monitor lizard that stretched over 15 feet and would have made a Komodo dragon look like a garden ornament. South America, thanks to millions of years of isolation, had developed its own parallel menagerie of the enormous, including the ground sloths, which had been evolving and diversifying there since the Miocene. The sheer density of large animals during the Pleistocene is difficult to overstate. Imagine standing on a grassy plain in what is now Texas, roughly 15,000 years ago. The air smells of sage and sun-warmed earth. The grass is tall, taller than you might expect, because the animals that grazed it kept it in a constant state of managed growth, the way a lawn looks different from a meadow. In the distance, a herd of mammoths moves slowly southward, their silhouettes enormous against the sky. Closer, a group of horses, yes, horses were native to North America long before the Spanish brought them back, grazes alongside camels, because camels, too, evolved in North America before migrating to Asia and Africa. A ground sloth, perhaps Paramylodon harlani, stands at the edge of a tree line, rearing up on its hind legs to reach a branch, its massive claws curling around the wood with a grip that could strip bark as easily as you might peel an orange. Its fur is coarse and thick, tinged with the reddish-brown of the soil it has been digging through. It is not fast. It does not need to be. It has been doing exactly this for millions of years, and nothing about its posture suggests it is aware that the arrangement is temporary. That is the scene. That is the backdrop. And the extinction that erased it was one of the most catastrophic losses of animal life in the last 66 million years since the asteroid that ended the age of dinosaurs. The Quaternary extinction event, as it is formally known, eliminated roughly 75% of large mammal species in the Americas, with similar though less extreme losses in Australia and Eurasia. Africa and southern Asia were largely spared, which is one of the reasons those continents still have elephants, rhinoceroses, and large predators, and the Americas do not. The extinctions were not instantaneous. They rolled across different continents at different times, arriving in Australia around 46,000 years ago, reaching the Americas roughly between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago, and continuing on isolated islands for several thousand years after that. But the pattern, once you see it, is unmistakable. Large animals disappeared. Small animals, mostly, did not. And the disappearances correlated uncomfortably, persistently, stubbornly with the arrival of one particular species. We will get to that species later. For now, let us stay with what was lost, because the magnitude of it deserves a moment of reckoning. North America, before the extinctions, had a large mammal fauna that rivaled modern Africa's. After the extinctions, it had deer, bison, moose, elk, pronghorn antelope, black bears, grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolves. That is not nothing, but it is a fraction. It is the remainder after someone has crossed out most of the names on a very long list. The mastodons are gone. The mammoths are gone. The saber-toothed cats, the dire wolves, the short-faced bears, the glyptodonts, the giant beavers, the American lions, the American cheetahs, yes. There were cheetahs in North America, which is why the pronghorn antelope can run 70 miles per hour despite the fact that nothing currently alive on the continent can catch it. It is still running from a ghost, all gone. And the ground sloths, every last species, every population, from the enormous Megatherium of the Argentine pampas to the relatively modest Nothrotheriops of the American Southwest, from the cave-dwelling Mylodon of Patagonia to the island populations of the Caribbean gone. The Pleistocene extinction was not like the dinosaur extinction. There was no asteroid. There was no single cataclysmic moment that you can point to and say, there, that is when it happened. It was slower than that, and in some ways more terrible for being slow, because it meant that the dying was drawn out, species by species, population by population, over thousands of years. It meant that there were last individuals, not just as a statistical inevitability, but as a lived reality, a final megatherium, standing somewhere in South America, the last of a lineage that stretched back to the Oligocene, alone in a landscape that had once been full of others like it, with no awareness of what it represented and no audience for its passing. That is what extinction looks like, up close. Not a bang, not even a whimper, just a gradual thinning of the world, a slow subtraction, until one day the equation reaches zero and no one is left to notice. The ground sloth was one entry on that long list of the erased, but it was not a minor entry. It was, in many ways, the most remarkable animal on the list, the longest lived, the most widely distributed, the most ecologically significant. And its story, when you trace it from origin to disappearance, is not a story of failure. It is a story of extraordinary, patient, almost unreasonable success, followed by an ending that the animal had no way to anticipate and no capacity to prevent. That is the story we are telling tonight. And it begins, as all stories of the enormous eventually must, with bones. Chapter 2. A body built for endurance, not speed. Let us talk about what a giant ground sloth actually was, because the name itself is somewhat misleading, and the popular image, to the extent that one exists, is almost entirely wrong. When most people hear ground sloth, they picture a tree sloth that has been scaled up and placed on the ground, perhaps moving with the same glacial, almost meditative slowness of its modern arboreal relatives, hanging from nothing in particular, blinking with the benign vacancy of an animal that has nowhere to be and is in no hurry to get there. This is inaccurate. The modern tree sloths, the two-toed and three-toed sloths of Central and South American rainforests, are indeed related to the giant ground sloths, but they are related in the way that a house cat is related to a lion. The family resemblance is there if you squint, but the scale and the context are so different as to make the comparison almost misleading. The giant ground sloths were not small, they were not cute, and while they were certainly not fast, the word sloth in their name, with all its connotations of laziness and torpor, does a disservice to animals that were, in fact, spectacularly well adapted to the demands of their environment. They were built like fortresses, they moved like glaciers, and they endured across continents, across climates, across geological epochs with a tenacity that puts most mammalian lineages to shame. Begin with Megatherium americanum, because it is the species most people are referring to, whether they know it or not, when they say giant ground sloth. Megatherium was, to put it plainly, enormous. An adult male stood roughly 12 feet tall when rearing up on its hind legs, which it did regularly, either to reach high foliage or, some researchers have speculated, to intimidate potential threats. On all fours it was still about 6 feet at the shoulder. It weighed somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 metric tons, which puts it in the same weight class as a large African elephant. Let that register for a moment. An animal the size of an elephant, covered in coarse, shaggy fur, with claws on its forelimbs that measured up to a foot in length, standing upright in the grasslands of Pleistocene South America. This was not a creature that invited casual interaction. The skeleton of Megatherium is one of the most immediately striking things you can encounter in a natural history museum, and if you have ever stood beneath one, you know that the experience is less, "Oh, how interesting," and more, "How was this real?" The bones are massive, dense, heavy, built to support an animal that carried its own weight the way a building carries its foundation. The pelvis is enormously broad, providing a stable base for bipedal posture. The femur is thick and slightly bowed, suggesting powerful, weight-bearing legs that moved with deliberation rather than speed. The rib cage is barrel-shaped, enclosing a torso that speaks of a voluminous gut, the kind of digestive system you need when your diet consists of tough, fibrous plant material that requires extensive fermentation to break down. The skull is relatively small for the body, with a blunt snout and deep jaw muscles that indicate powerful grinding mastication. This was not an animal that delicately nibbled at tender shoots. This was an animal that stripped branches, crushed woody stems, and processed plant material with the methodical efficiency of an industrial compactor. But the claws are what stay with you. Each forelimb ended in enormous curved claws, not sharp in the way a cat's claws are sharp, not designed for slicing or piercing, but curved and robust, shaped like elongated hooks. In Megatherium, these claws were so large that the animal could not place its forefeet flat on the ground. Instead, it walked on the sides of its hands, with the claws curled inward, leaving a distinctive track that paleontologists can identify immediately. The claws served multiple purposes. They were tools for pulling down branches, for stripping bark, for digging into soil and possibly into termite mounds. They may also have served as defensive weapons, and here the imagination does not need to stretch far. A lateral swipe from a Megatherium forelimb, driven by the musculature of a 5-ton animal, would have been devastating. Some researchers have noted that even Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, shows little evidence of regularly predating adult ground sloths. The risk calculus simply did not favour it. You might bring down a young one, an old one, a sick one, but a healthy adult Megatherium standing on its hind legs with those claws extended was not prey. It was a problem you walked around. Megatherium was the largest of the ground sloths, but it was far from the only one. The family Megatheriidae, to which it belonged, was just one branch of a spectacularly diverse radiation. Eremotherium lariadi, sometimes called the Pan-American ground sloth, was nearly as large as Megatherium and ranged much farther north, its fossils found from Brazil to Florida. Eremotherium was in many ways the northern counterpart to Megatherium's southern dominion, and the two species together blanketed the Americas in a way that few mammalian genera have ever managed. Mylodon darwini, named with a certain poetic justice after Charles Darwin, who collected some of its remains during the voyage of the Beagle, was smaller, perhaps a ton or two, and inhabited the cooler grasslands and shrublands of southern South America. Mylodon is famous not just for its fossils but for the remarkable preservation of its remains in the caves of Patagonia, where dry conditions preserve not just bone but skin, fur, and dung in a state that borders on the uncanny. To hold a piece of Mylodon skin, and such pieces exist, leathery and tough, with small bony nodules called osteoderms embedded in the dermis like natural chainmail, is to hold something that challenges your sense of how long ago extinct really means. It does not feel like 11,000 years, it feels like last week. In North America, the diversity was equally impressive, if less celebrated. Paramylodon harlani, a medium to large ground sloth, is one of the most common fossils recovered from the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, which tells you something about both the animal's abundance and its occasional lack of situational awareness regarding natural asphalt seeps. Nothrotheriops shastensis, the Shasta ground sloth, was smaller still, perhaps the size of a large bear, and inhabited the arid southwest, where its beautifully preserved dung has been recovered from dry caves in Arizona and Nevada, providing an almost embarrassingly detailed record of what it ate, when it ate, and how its diet shifted with the seasons. And then there was Megalonyx jeffersonii, Jefferson's ground sloth, named after Thomas Jefferson, who received a shipment of large bones from a cave in West Virginia in 1797, and, in a moment of enthusiasm that historians have been dining out on ever since, initially concluded that they belonged to an enormous lion. Jefferson, it should be noted, was not a paleontologist. He was the Vice President of the United States. But he was a man of Catholic interests, and the bones fascinated him enough that he presented a paper on them to the American Philosophical Society, arguing that such a magnificent creature must surely still be roaming the unexplored interior of the continent. He was wrong about the lion part, and he was wrong about the still living part, but his instinct that the bones represented something significant was entirely correct. The animal was eventually identified as a ground sloth by Caspar Wistar and later formally described, and the species name Jeffersonii was applied in honour of the president's enthusiastic, if slightly misdirected, contribution to American paleontology. There is something endearing about Jefferson's era. He looked at the claws and saw a predator. The actual animal was an herbivore that probably spent most of its time eating leaves and had the disposition of a very large, very slow cow. The ground sloths, taken as a group, represent one of the most successful radiations of large mammals in the Cenozoic era. They first appeared in South America during the late Eocene or early Oligocene, somewhere around 35 to 40 million years ago, and over the following tens of millions of years, they diversified into an astonishing array of forms. Some were small, barely larger than a dog. Some were enormous. Some were semi-aquatic, a possibility raised by isotopic analysis of certain species' bones. Some were burrowers, excavating tunnels of remarkable size and depth. Some were browsers, feeding on leaves and shoots from trees. Others may have been mixed feeders, supplementing their plant diet with carrion or even, as some controversial analyses have suggested, occasionally feeding on meat, though this remains deeply disputed, and most paleontologists regard ground sloths as overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, herbivorous. The key to the ground sloth's success, the thing that allowed this lineage to persist for roughly 20 million years across 2 continents, was not any single spectacular adaptation. It was, instead, a suite of characteristics that, taken together, made the animal almost absurdly resilient. Start with metabolism. Ground sloths, like their modern tree-dwelling relatives, almost certainly had low metabolic rates. This is not a guess, it is an inference drawn from multiple lines of evidence, including bone histology, body mass scaling, and comparison with living xenarthrans, the superorder to which sloths, anteaters, and armadillos belong. A low metabolic rate means lower energy requirements. Lower energy requirements mean less food needed per day. Less food needed per day means a wider range of habitable environments and a greater tolerance for resource scarcity. In a world of fluctuating climates, advancing and retreating glaciers, and periodic droughts, an animal that could get by on relatively little had a significant advantage over one that required a constant, abundant food supply. The ground sloth was, in metabolic terms, extraordinarily efficient. It was the fuel-sipping compact car of the Pleistocene megafauna in a world full of gas-guzzling SUVs. Then there was the digestive system. Ground sloths were hindgut fermenters, processing their food in an enlarged cecum and colon, similar in principle to modern horses and elephants. This allowed them to extract nutrients from low-quality plant material, tough leaves, woody stems, fibrous bark that more selective feeders would have passed over. The enormous barrel chest visible in ground sloth skeletons is not just structural, it reflects a gut of prodigious volume, a fermentation vat capable of breaking down the most intractable vegetation over extended periods. This is not glamorous. It is not the kind of adaptation that inspires awe in the way that a saber-toothed cat's canines do, but it is profoundly effective. The ability to eat almost anything green and to extract nutrition from material that other herbivores would reject meant that ground sloths could colonize environments ranging from tropical forests to semi-arid scrublands to temperate grasslands. They were not specialists. They were generalists of the most thoroughgoing kind, and in evolution generalists tend to last. Add to this the osteoderm's small bony nodules embedded in the skin, particularly well documented in Mylodon and its relatives. These were not as dramatic as the armour plating of glyptodonts, but they provided a layer of protection that would have made the skin difficult to pierce, especially for predators relying on slashing or biting attacks. A predator attempting to take down an adult Mylodon would have encountered not just the claws and the sheer mass of the animal, but a hide reinforced with bone. It is the biological equivalent of wearing chainmail under a fur coat. Not invulnerable, certainly, but enough to shift the cost-benefit analysis in the sloth's favour. And then there was the size itself. Size, in evolutionary terms, is a double-edged sword. It provides protection from predators and access to food sources that smaller animals cannot reach. But it also demands more resources and makes populations more vulnerable to environmental disruption. The ground sloths seem to have found the sweet spot, or rather several sweet spots, with species ranging from bear-sized to elephant-sized occupying different niches and different continents. The largest species, Megatherium and Erematherium, were essentially immune to predation as adults. Nothing in their ecosystem could reliably kill a healthy, full-grown individual. This is not speculation. It is a conclusion drawn from the fossil record, which shows remarkably few instances of predator damage on adult ground sloth bones. The ground sloth's defense strategy was not speed, not agility, not camouflage, not herding. It was simply being too big, too tough, and too dangerous to be worth the effort. It was the evolutionary equivalent of being the one house on the block, with a really good security system, not impossible to rob, but sufficiently inconvenient that the burglar moves on to easier targets. The paradox of the ground sloth's body plan is that it looks, to modern eyes, like a design error, slow, ponderous, clumsy, lacking the grace of a deer, the speed of a horse, the agility of a cat. It seems like an animal that should not have worked, that should have been outcompeted or predated into oblivion long before the Pleistocene, and yet it did work. It worked spectacularly well, for an almost inconceivable length of time. 20 million years. To put that in perspective, the entire genus Homo, every species of human that has ever existed, from Homo habilis to Homo sapiens, spans roughly 2 to 3 million years. The ground sloth lineage outlasted us 7 times over, and it is not finished yet in the counting, because we are still here and still early in our run. Whether we will match their record is, to put it charitably, an open question. The ground sloth's body was not built for speed. It was built for endurance, for patience, for the long game of survival played out across geological time, where the winners are not the fastest or the fiercest, but the most durable, the most adaptable, the most capable of absorbing change and continuing. The ground sloth absorbed ice ages. It absorbed the Great American Interchange, when the formation of the Isthmus of Panama connected North and South America and triggered a massive exchange of fauna that drove many South American species to extinction, but not the ground sloths, which instead colonized North America with remarkable success. It absorbed millions of years of predator evolution, coexisting with saber-toothed cats, terror birds, and giant crocodilians without apparent difficulty. It absorbed everything the world threw at it for 20 million years. And then, in the final reel, something changed. Something arrived that the ground sloth's extraordinary body, its patient metabolism, its reinforced hide and devastating claws could not absorb. But we are not there yet. For now, let us sit with the animal, as it was immense, unhurried, improbable, and alive. Alive for so long that the mind reels at the duration. Alive in a way that demands respect, even from those of us who will never see it except in bone. Chapter 3. The Empire of the Slow. If you wanted to find a giant ground sloth during the late Pleistocene, and setting aside for the moment the question of why you would want to, given that the animal weighed several tons and had claws the length of your forearm, you would have had an almost embarrassing number of options. Ground sloths were not rare. They were not confined to a single habitat or a narrow geographic range. They were, by any reasonable measure, everywhere. Consider the range. In South America, ground sloths occupied virtually every terrestrial biome the continent had to offer. Megatherium roamed the pampas of Argentina and Uruguay, those vast flat grasslands that stretched to the horizon like a green ocean. Mylodon inhabited the cooler, windswept landscapes of Patagonia, sheltering in caves when the weather turned, leaving behind the dung and fur that would one day make it one of the best documented extinct animals on Earth. Eremotherium ranged across the tropical and subtropical zones of Brazil, Venezuela, and Central America, its enormous frame moving through forests and savannas with equal facility. Smaller species occupied Andean valleys, coastal scrublands, and the dense forests of the Amazon basin. In North America, the pattern repeated. Eremotherium pushed as far north as the southeastern United States, its fossils found in Florida, Georgia, and Texas. Paramylodon harlani ranged across the western and central portions of the continent, from California to Pennsylvania. Megalonyx jeffersonii, Jefferson's ground sloth, was found from the eastern seaboard to the Pacific Northwest, and as far north as Alaska and the Yukon. Nothrotheriopsis chastensis occupied the arid southwest Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, West Texas, living in a landscape of canyons and dry washes that seems, at first glance, like an unlikely home for an animal of its size, until you realize that the late Pleistocene Southwest was considerably wetter and more vegetated than it is today. And then there were the islands. Ground sloths colonized the Caribbean, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Curacao, arriving, presumably, by swimming or by crossing land bridges exposed during periods of low sea level. On these islands, they underwent the process of island dwarfism, shrinking over generations in response to limited resources and reduced predation pressure, until some Caribbean ground sloths were no larger than a medium-sized dog. This is the same evolutionary process that produced dwarf elephants on Mediterranean islands and dwarf mammoths on the Channel Islands off California, and it speaks to the ground sloth's extraordinary adaptability. Give it a continent, and it grew to the size of an elephant. Give it an island, and it shrank to fit. The body plan was not rigid. It was a platform, capable of modification, of fine-tuning, of responding to the demands of local conditions with the pragmatic flexibility of an organism that had been evolving for tens of millions of years and had, by this point, gotten very good at it. The range alone is impressive, but range is only part of the story. What matters more, what makes the ground sloth genuinely extraordinary rather than merely widespread, is what it did to the landscapes it inhabited. The ground sloth was not a passive occupant of its environment. It was an ecosystem engineer, a term that ecologists use to describe organisms that physically modify their habitat in ways that affect other species. Elephants are ecosystem engineers. They knock down trees, creating clearings that allow grasslands to expand, which in turn supports a different suite of animal and plant species. Beavers are ecosystem engineers. They build dams, creating ponds and wetlands that reshape entire watersheds. The ground sloth, it turns out, was an ecosystem engineer of the first order, and the evidence for this is written not just in the fossil record but in the living landscape. Start with the burrows. In southern Brazil, particularly in the states of Rio Grande do Sul and Santa Catarina, there are tunnels, large tunnels. Tunnels that extend dozens of meters into hillsides, with cross-sections large enough for a person to walk through upright and, in some cases, large enough to drive a small car through. For years, geologists assumed these were natural formation solution cavities carved by water moving through soluble rock, or remnants of ancient lava tubes. Then someone looked more closely at the walls. The walls are covered in claw marks, long parallel grooves scored into the rock with a regularity and a force that no natural geological process could produce. These are paleoburrows tunnels excavated by giant ground sloths, and in some cases by giant armadillos during the Pleistocene. The scale is staggering. Some of these burrows are over 100 meters long. Their ceilings are smooth, where the animals' backs rubbed against the rock over generations of use. The claw marks are so well preserved that you can, in some cases, count the individual digits and determine which species made them. Researchers like Heinrich Frank at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul have documented hundreds of these structures, and the number keeps growing as more are discovered. Think about what these burrows represent. An animal, or rather, many animals, over many generations dug tunnels into solid rock using nothing but its claws. The tunnels were not temporary. They were maintained, reused, expanded. Some show evidence of multiple species claw marks, suggesting that burrows were excavated by one species and later occupied or modified by another. The purpose of the burrows is debated. They may have served as shelter from weather or predators, as nesting sites, or as thermoregulatory refuges, keeping the animals cool in summer and warm in winter. Whatever their function, they represent an enormous investment of energy and a physical transformation of the landscape that persists to this day. The burrows are still there. You can walk into them. You can run your fingers along the claw marks and feel the grooves left by an animal that has been dead for 10,000 years. The rock remembers what the world has forgotten, but the burrows, impressive as they are, may not even be the most significant way ground sloths shaped their environment. That distinction probably belongs to their role in seed dispersal, a role that, in its absence, has left gaps in ecosystems that are still visible, still consequential, and still, in a quiet way, heartbreaking. Here is the problem. Many plants in the Americas produce large fruits with big, fleshy pulps surrounding large seeds. The avocado is the most famous example, but it is far from the only one. Osage oranges, the bumpy green fruits that fall from Maclura pomifera trees across the eastern United States, are another. Honey locust pods, with their sweet pulp encasing hard seeds, Kentucky coffee tree, pawpaw, persimmon to some extent. These fruits share a common characteristic. They are too large to be effectively dispersed by any animal currently living in the Americas. Squirrels ignore Osage oranges. Birds cannot swallow avocado pits. Deer do not eat honey locust pods with any regularity. These fruits fall from their parent trees, rot on the ground, and their seeds germinate, if they germinate at all, in the shadow of the parent, where competition for light and nutrients is most intense. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes no sense. Plants do not invest the considerable energy required to produce large, fleshy fruits unless those fruits serve a purpose. And the purpose of fruit, in almost every case, is to attract an animal that will eat it, carry the seed in its gut, and deposit it somewhere far from the parent tree, wrapped in a convenient package of fertilizer. The fruit is a bribe. The animal is the courier. The system works, or it did, until the couriers went extinct. The ground sloths were among the primary dispersers of large fruited plants in the Americas. Their enormous guts, their Catholic diets, their wide-ranging movements across landscapes, all of these made them ideal seed dispersers for plants producing large fruits. An avocado pit that enters the digestive tract of a 5-ton Eremitherium emerges. some hours or days later, miles from where it was consumed, scarified by stomach acids in a way that promotes germination, and deposited in a mound of nutrient-rich dung. The avocado tree gets its seeds dispersed. The ground sloth gets a meal. The system is elegant, efficient, and ancient, the result of millions of years of coevolution between plant and animal. And then the animal disappeared, and the plant was left holding a fruit that no one was coming to collect. The term for this is ecological anachronism, coined by the botanist Dan Jansen and the ecologist Paul Martin in a landmark 1982 paper. An ecological anachronism is a trait, a fruit size, a thorn pattern, a chemical defense that makes sense only in the context of an animal that no longer exists. The avocado's enormous pit is an anachronism. The Osage orange's tough, bitter rind is an anachronism. It was probably designed to deter smaller animals while attracting the attention of megafauna that could handle the size and tolerate the taste. The honey locust's wicked thorns, which can grow up to 8 inches long and cluster on the trunk in dense, branching arrays, are an anachronism. They are defensive structures aimed at browsers large enough to damage the tree. Browsers like ground sloths and mastodons. Browsers that no longer exist. The trees are still defending themselves against ghosts. This is the concept of ghost ecology, and it is one of the most haunting ideas in modern ecology, the notion that ecosystems are still shaped by the absence of animals that vanished thousands of years ago. The forests of the Americas are ghost forests in a sense. Their composition, their structure, their distribution, all of these have been altered by the loss of the megafauna that once moved through them, dispersing seeds, opening clearings, fertilizing soil, and maintaining the mosaic of habitats that allowed maximum biodiversity. Remove the megafauna, and the forest changes. It becomes denser in some places, sparser in others. Certain tree species decline because their seeds are no longer being dispersed. Other species expand into the gaps. The entire system shifts, slowly, over centuries and millennia, toward a new equilibrium, one shaped not by the animals that are present, but by the animals that are absent. The ground sloth was not the only megafaunal seed disperser, of course. Mammoths, mastodons, gomphithers, horses, camels all played roles in the dispersal networks of Pleistocene ecosystems. But the ground sloths, with their enormous range, their dietary flexibility, and their sheer abundance, were among the most important. Their disappearance did not just remove an animal from the landscape. It removed a process. It broke connections between plants and the animals that moved their seeds. It fragmented ecosystems in ways that are subtle, slow-acting, and still unfolding. There is a version of the Americas that the ground sloth shaped a version with different forests, different grasslands, different distributions of trees and shrubs and fruits, and we do not live in that version. We live in the aftermath. We live in the version that emerged after the engineers left the building, and the building slowly began to change. The empire of the slow was not a kingdom of territory alone. It was a kingdom of influence, of ecological connections, of co-evolutionary partnerships, of landscape-scale processes that depended on the presence of enormous, slow-moving herbivores doing what they had always done, eating, moving, digging, defecating, and in doing so, maintaining the intricate machinery of the living world. When the ground sloths disappeared, the machinery did not stop, but it stuttered, it skipped. It began to run in ways it was never designed to run, compensating for missing parts with makeshift substitutions that were never quite as good as the originals. 10,000 years later, it is still running. But the ghosts are still there, in the fruits that fall and rot, in the tunnels that lead nowhere, in the silence where something enormous used to be. Chapter 4. The Dung and the Data. Science, at its most honest, is not glamorous. It is not the dramatic eureka moments that popular culture loves to depict, the lone genius in a lightning flash of insight, the expedition that uncovers a perfectly preserved skeleton gleaming in the desert sun. Science, most of the time, is a person in a lab or a cave or a dusty repository, doing something tedious with extraordinary care, and hoping that the tedium will eventually yield something meaningful. The study of giant ground sloths is a case in point. Much of what we know about these animals, their diets, their habitats, Their final centuries of existence comes not from spectacular fossils but from dung. Preserved, desiccated, 11,000-year-old dung, recovered from dry caves in the American Southwest and the windswept caverns of Patagonia, and subjected to the kind of meticulous analysis that would try the patience of a medieval monk. Rampart Cave, perched in the cliffs above the Colorado River in the western Grand Canyon, is perhaps the most famous example. The cave was used by Shasta ground sloths, Nothrotheriops shastensis, for thousands of years, and over those millennia, the animals deposited an enormous quantity of dung on the cave floor. The dry conditions of the cave preserved this material in a state that borders on the miraculous, not fossilized, not mineralized, but simply desiccated, dried out so thoroughly by the arid desert air that decomposition was halted in its tracks. When researchers first entered Rampart Cave in the early 20th century, they found layers of ground sloth dung several feet deep, stretching back in time like a stratigraphic record of the animal's existence. The dung was fibrous, compacted, and identifiable. You could pick up a bolus, a rounded mass of processed plant material, and, with the right training and the right microscope, determine exactly what the animal had been eating: desert globe mallow. Mormon tea, cactus, Joshua tree leaves. The diet varied with the seasons and with the millennia, shifting as the climate changed and the available vegetation responded, and all of it was recorded, faithfully and in astonishing detail, in the layers of dung accumulating on the cave floor. The technical term for preserved feces, in case you were wondering, is coprolite, though that term is usually reserved for fully mineralized specimens. The Rampart Cave material is technically subfossil, not yet turned to stone, still organic, still capable of yielding information that true fossils cannot. And the information it yields is remarkable. Pollen grains embedded in the dung tell researchers what plants were flowering in the vicinity of the cave and when. Plant macrofossils, fragments of leaves, stems, seeds, and fibers reveal the specific species the sloths were consuming. Radiocarbon dating of the dung itself provides precise chronological data, allowing researchers to construct a timeline of occupation that stretches back roughly 40,000 years. The most recent layers of dung at Rampart Cave date to approximately 11,000 years before present, which means that the cave was occupied by ground sloths right up until, or very nearly, until the moment the species disappeared. The dung, in other words, records not just the life of the animal but its ending. The final layers are the final meals. Somewhere in that stratigraphy is the dung of the last Shasta ground sloth to use Rampart Cave, and it is a strange and sobering thing to realize that you can hold, in a sense, the last supper of an extinct species in your hands. Tragically, a significant portion of the Rampart Cave deposits was destroyed by a fire in 1976, likely set by vandals. The loss was incalculable, thousands of years of irreplaceable paleontological data reduced to ash in a few hours. What survived, however, has been sufficient to construct a remarkably detailed picture of the Shasta ground sloth's ecology, and the ongoing analysis of these materials continues to refine our understanding. At the other end of the Americas, in Patagonia, a different cave tells a complementary story. Cueva del Milodon Cave is located near Puerto Natales, Chile, at the edge of the world, where the Andes begin their descent toward the southern oceans and the wind blows with a persistence that suggests a personal grudge. The cave is enormous, a cathedral-sized cavity in the rock, and it was here, in the 1890s, that a rancher named Herman Eberhard discovered a large piece of preserved skin, thick, leathery, embedded with small bony nodules, and still bearing traces of coarse reddish-brown fur. The discovery electrified the scientific world, and for a brief, giddy period, there was serious speculation that the animal might still be alive somewhere in the vast, unexplored wilderness of Patagonia. Expeditions were mounted. The London Daily Express offered a reward for its capture. Hunters and adventurers tramped through the southern forests, with the optimistic determination of people who have decided that extinction is a condition that can be overturned by sufficient enthusiasm. It could not. Radiocarbon dating eventually confirmed that the Mylodon remains were approximately 10,000 years old, and the expeditions quietly disbanded. but the cave yielded far more than just the skin. Bones, dung, hair, and even traces of what appeared to be cut grass, possibly evidence that humans had kept the animals in some form of captivity or at least modified the cave environment, were recovered, though the interpretation of this last finding remains contentious. The preserved dung from Mylodon Cave, like that from Rampart Cave, provided detailed information about the animal's diet, revealing a preference for grasses and sedges consistent with the open, wind-swept grasslands of late Pleistocene Patagonia. The point of all this, the dung, the caves, the meticulous analysis of 10,000-year-old fecal matter, is that our knowledge of ground sloths is built not on dramatic discoveries, but on patient, unglamorous, cumulative work. The science of paleontology is often imagined as a field of grand expeditions and spectacular finds, and certainly those moments exist. But the real substance of the discipline, the texture of understanding, comes from the slow accretion of data points, each one small and seemingly insignificant in isolation, but together forming a picture of extraordinary resolution. Fossilized bones tell us about body size, posture, and musculature. Isotopic analysis of bone collagen and tooth enamel reveals diet and habitat. The ratios of carbon and nitrogen isotopes vary depending on what an animal ate and the environment it lived in, allowing researchers to distinguish between forest browsers and grassland grazers, between animals that drank from rivers and those that relied on the moisture in their food. Ancient DNA, extracted from preserved bone, hair, and dung, provides information about genetic diversity, population structure, and evolutionary relationships, and has, in recent years, overturned several long-standing assumptions about ground sloth taxonomy. Where we once grouped species based solely on skeletal morphology, DNA analysis has revealed unexpected relationships, splitting some species and lumping others, and revealing that the ground sloths were, if anything, more diverse than the fossil record alone suggested. And then there are the trackways. Fossil footprints, preserved in ancient mud or sand that subsequently hardened to rock, provide something that bones alone cannot, a record of behaviour, how the animal moved, how fast it travelled, whether it walked alone or in groups, the size and spacing of its stride, which can be used to estimate speed and gait. Ground sloth trackways have been found at several sites across the Americas, but the most extraordinary, the most revelatory and the most haunting are the tracks at White Sands, New Mexico, which we will return to in detail later, because what they show is not just a ground sloth walking, they show a ground sloth being followed. The fossil record of the ground sloth is, in the end, a testament to the power of patient inquiry. We did not discover these animals all at once. We discovered them piece by piece, bone by bone, coprolite by coprolite, over the course of 2 centuries. The first ground sloth skeleton to be scientifically described was assembled in 1789 from bones found near the Luján River in Argentina, a megatherium, enormous and bewildering, reconstructed and displayed in Madrid at the Real Gabinete de Historia Natural. Georges Cuvier, the father of comparative anatomy, studied the bones and recognized them as belonging to an enormous, extinct relative of the modern tree sloth, a conclusion that was, at the time, both revolutionary and disturbing, because it implied that species could disappear entirely, a notion that challenged prevailing theological assumptions about the completeness of creation. Darwin, a few decades later, found ground sloth bones during the Beagle voyage and sent them back to England, where Richard Owen, one of the most brilliant and most personally unpleasant naturalists of the 19th century, described Mylodon and several other species. Jefferson, in America, had his lion that turned out to be a sloth, and since then, generation after generation of paleontologists, geologists, and ecologists have added to the record, each contribution small, each one essential, each one bringing us marginally closer to understanding what these animals were, how they lived, and why they died. The intimacy of this work is worth noting. There is something deeply personal about reconstructing an extinct animal's last meals from its preserved feces, to about running your fingers along claw marks in a tunnel and knowing that the claws that made them belong to an animal that has been dead for 10 millennia. Science, at its best, is not just about knowledge. It is about connection, about reaching across the abyss of time and touching, however briefly, something that is gone. The dung is not glamorous, the claw marks are not dramatic, but they are real, and they are here, and they tell us, in their quiet, unglamorous way, that something enormous once existed, and that we can still, if we are patient and careful and willing to get our hands dirty, come to know it. Mini-documentary, Darwin's Strange Bones. In September of 1832, a young English naturalist named Charles Darwin, 23 years old and prone to seasickness, stood on a beach near Punta Alta in Bahia Blanca, Argentina, and began to dig. He was 2 years into the voyage of HMS Beagle, the journey that would eventually reshape his understanding of the natural world and, in turn, the world's understanding of itself. But on that particular day, he was not thinking about evolution or natural selection or the origin of species. He was thinking about bones. Large bones. Very large bones, emerging from the cliffside in a jumble of fossil fragments that he recognized, even with his limited paleontological training, as extraordinary. Over the following weeks, Darwin collected an enormous quantity of fossil material from Punta Alta and nearby sites along the Argentine coast. There were bones of giant armadillos, or what appeared to be giant armadillos and enormous rodent-like creatures, and, most strikingly, the remains of several very large mammals that Darwin could not immediately identify. He packed them carefully, labelled them meticulously, and shipped them back to England, where they would eventually be examined by Richard Owen, the foremost comparative anatomist of the age. Owen was a complex figure, brilliant, ambitious, prickly, and not above taking credit for other people's work, but his analytical skills were unquestioned. And when the crates from South America arrived at the Royal College of Surgeons, he set to work with characteristic precision. What Owen found in those crates was, in part, the bones of Mylodon darwinii, a species he named in honour of the young naturalist who had collected them. This was one of Owen's more gracious moments. He was not always so generous with attribution. The bones told a story that was, to 19th century science, deeply unsettling. Here was an animal of enormous size, clearly related to the modern tree sloths of South American forests, but terrestrial, much larger and critically extinct. Extinction itself was not a new concept by the 1830s. Cuvier had established the reality of extinction decades earlier with his studies of fossil elephants and other vanished species. But the South American fossils added a new dimension to the problem, because they raised the question of why. Why had these enormous animals disappeared from a continent that still supported large mammals? Why were there giant armadillo fossils in a land where armadillos still lived, but only in diminished form? Why had the largest species vanished while their smaller relatives survived? Darwin noticed this pattern, the relationship between the extinct giants and their living relatives, and it lodged in his mind like a splinter. In The Voyage of the Beagle, published in 1839, he wrote of his astonishment at finding the remains of enormous animals in a landscape that seemed perfectly capable of supporting them. The food was there. The habitat was there. The climate, while different, was not inhospitable. What, then, had killed them? Darwin did not have an answer. Not yet. But the question, the gap between what the land could support and what it actually contained, became one of the threads that would eventually lead him toward his theory of natural selection and, more broadly, toward a view of life as mutable, contingent, and marked by loss as much as by creation. It is one of the quieter ironies of scientific history that the ground sloth, an animal defined by slowness and patience, played a small but real role in the development of the most transformative idea in the history of biology. Darwin's strange bones did not provide the answer, but they helped shape the question. And the question, why do species disappear, is one we are still asking, with increasing urgency, nearly 2 centuries later. Chapter 5, When Humans Arrived. There is a moment in the history of life on Earth, not a single moment, exactly, but a compressed span of time that functions, in retrospect, like a hinge when the relationship between humans and the natural world changed from coexistence to something else, something harder to name, something that involved, depending on your perspective, ingenuity or devastation or both, often simultaneously. The arrival of modern humans in the Americas is that moment, and its consequences are still being measured. The timing of human arrival in the Americas is one of the most contentiously debated questions in archaeology, and if you want to start an argument at a paleontology conference or indeed a very quiet dinner party, simply state a date with confidence and wait. The traditional model, known as Clovis first, held that the first Americans were the Clovis people, who crossed from Siberia to Alaska via the Beringia land bridge and moved south through an ice-free corridor roughly 13,500 years ago. This model was clean, simple, and elegant, which in science is often a warning sign. Beginning in the late 20th century, a growing body of evidence challenged Clovis, first pushing the date of human arrival back to at least 16,000 years ago and possibly much earlier. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, with its remarkably well-preserved evidence of human occupation dating to roughly 14,500 years ago, predating Clovis by a millennium, were initially controversial, but eventually gained acceptance. More recent discoveries, including the White Sands footprints in New Mexico, which have been dated to approximately 21,000 to 23,000 years before present, suggest that humans may have been in the Americas far earlier than most models predicted, though these dates remain debated and the evidence is still being evaluated. Whatever the exact timing, the broad outline is clear. At some point during the late Pleistocene, humans, Homo sapiens, already equipped with sophisticated stone tool technology, organized hunting strategies, fire, language, and the kind of adaptability that makes other species nervous arrived in a pair of continents that had never seen a hominin before. The megafauna of the Americas had evolved for millions of years without human predation. They had no experience of this particular threat, no evolved fear response, no instinctive recognition that the small, upright, relatively frail-looking bipeds arriving in their territories represented anything worth worrying about. In ecology, this is called prey naivety, and it is one of the most dangerous conditions an animal can find itself in. An animal that does not recognize a predator, does not flee from it, does not adjust its behavior, does not take the precautions that millions of years of coevolution with that predator would have instilled. It simply stands there. The ground sloth had no natural predators for millions of years. Then one showed up with a spear and an appetite, and the math changed overnight. This is where the evidence gets both extraordinary and heartbreaking. At White Sands National Park in New Mexico, in a dry lake bed called Lake Otero, a team of researchers led by Matthew Bennett and Sally Reynolds documented something remarkable. A series of fossilized footprints showing a human walking directly inside the footprints of a giant ground sloth. The tracks tell a story. The sloth, probably a paramylodon or a closely related species, was moving across the mudflat. A human followed, stepping deliberately into the sloth's much larger prints, matching its stride, tracking it. At one point, the sloth appears to have turned, reared up. The track pattern suggests it pivoted on its hind feet and faced its pursuer. There are additional human footprints around the site, suggesting that other individuals may have been involved, flanking the animal, perhaps driving it, perhaps harassing it from multiple directions. Think about that scene for a moment. A human being, perhaps 50,000 generations removed from the first Homo sapiens to walk out of Africa, standing in the late afternoon light of Pleistocene, New Mexico, ankle-deep in lake mud, looking up at an animal the size of a van. The animal, for its part, has turned to face this strange, small, persistent creature that has been following it across the flat. The air smells of alkali and sage. The ground is soft, and every footstep sinks and holds. Somewhere in the distance, perhaps, other humans are waiting, or circling. The sloth does not charge. It does not flee. Where would it go? It has never needed to flee. It simply stands and waits and faces this new thing that the world has produced. We do not know how this particular encounter ended. The tracks do not record a kill, but the pattern, the following, the flanking, the confrontation is consistent with hunting behavior, and it is consistent with what we know about how early humans interacted with megafauna in other parts of the world. The White Sands trackway is not proof that humans drove ground sloths to extinction. It is something more nuanced and, in some ways, more valuable. It is a snapshot, a single frame from a story that played out across thousands of years and 2 continents. It shows us, with a clarity that bones alone cannot provide, that humans and ground sloths occupied the same landscape at the same time, and that the relationship between them involved, at least occasionally, the focused, strategic pursuit of an animal that was far larger and far stronger than its pursuer, but that lacked the one advantage that might have saved it: the understanding that it was being hunted. The evidence for human hunting of ground sloths extends beyond white sands, though it remains frustratingly sparse. Butchery marks, cut marks, percussion marks, and scraping marks on bone that are consistent with defleshing and marrow extraction using stone tools have been identified on ground sloth bones at several sites in South America, though interpretation is often complicated by the difficulty of distinguishing human-made marks from those caused by trampling, geological pressure, or the gnawing of scavengers. In North America, direct evidence of ground sloth hunting is rarer, which may reflect the difficulty of finding evidence rather than the absence of the behaviour. Megafauna hunting does not always leave unambiguous traces in the archaeological record, particularly when the prey animal is large enough that a carcass can be processed and consumed without breaking bones, for marrow the signature that is easiest to identify. And yet, the circumstantial case is strong. Across the Americas, the extinction of ground sloths along with the broader suite of megafauna correlates with the arrival and spread of human populations. The timing is not perfect, and the picture varies from region to region, but the overall pattern is difficult to dismiss. In North America, the most severe pulse of megafaunal extinction occurs between roughly 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, coinciding with the spread of Clovis and post-Clovis human populations across the continent. In South America, the extinctions are slightly later, coinciding with the later arrival of humans in the southern parts of the continent. On Caribbean islands, where humans arrived much later, between roughly 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, ground sloths persisted much longer, surviving until approximately 4,400 years before present. This last point is critical. The correlation between human arrival and megafaunal extinction is visible not just at the continental scale, but at the island scale, where the variables are fewer and the pattern is correspondingly clearer. Humans arrive. Large animals disappear. The sequence repeats island after island, continent after continent, with a consistency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. This is the core of what Paul Martin, the ecologist and paleoecologist who spent much of his career at the University of Arizona, called the overkill hypothesis. Martin's argument, first articulated in the 1960s and refined over the following decades, was straightforward: the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions in the Americas and, by extension, in Australia and on islands worldwide were primarily caused by human hunting. Not necessarily in a dramatic, wasteful orgy of killing. The popular image of blitzkrieg overkill is a caricature of Martin's actual position, but through a sustained cumulative pressure that, applied to populations of large, slow-reproducing animals over hundreds or thousands of years, was sufficient to drive them below the threshold of viability. A ground sloth does not need to be killed in large numbers to go extinct. It merely needs to be killed slightly faster than it can reproduce, and over time the population dwindles, fragments, and eventually reaches a point where random fluctuations, a bad year, a disease outbreak, a drought, can eliminate the remaining individuals. The elegance of the overkill hypothesis is also its limitation. It is simple, perhaps too simple, and it does not account for the full complexity of the extinction event. The alternative, or, more accurately, the complement, is what has been termed the overkill hypothesis, the argument that climate change at the end of the Pleistocene was the primary driver of megafaunal extinction. The end of the last ice age, roughly 11,700 years ago, brought rapid and dramatic changes in temperature, precipitation, and vegetation patterns across the Americas. Forests advanced into grasslands. Water sources shifted or dried up. The mosaic of habitats that had supported a diverse megafauna was reorganized, often in ways that reduced the carrying capacity for large herbivores. The overkill hypothesis argues that these changes were sufficient, on their own, to drive many megafaunal species to extinction, without any need to invoke human hunting as a primary cause. The truth, and this is the uncomfortable, unsatisfying, but probably correct answer is almost certainly that both factors were involved, and that their interaction was more destructive than either would have been alone. Climate change at the end of the Pleistocene stressed megafaunal populations, reducing their numbers, fragmenting their ranges, and making them more vulnerable. Human hunting, even at relatively low levels, applied additional pressure to populations that were already struggling. Together, the two forces created a synergy, a vicious cycle in which climate-weakened populations were tipped over the edge by human predation, and human predation prevented populations from recovering during periods of climate amelioration. The ground sloth survived dozens of climate cycles during the Pleistocene glacial advances and retreats, warming and cooling, shifts in vegetation. It did not survive the first climate cycle that occurred with humans present. That is not a coincidence, but neither is it proof that humans alone were responsible. It is instead evidence of something more complex and more sobering, that extinction is rarely the result of a single cause, and that the combination of pressures that a species can tolerate has a threshold. And once that threshold is crossed, the decline can be swift and irreversible. There is an uncomfortable parallel here, and I will state it briefly because the facts are more eloquent than any commentary I could offer. The dynamic that likely killed the ground sloth climate change, combined with direct human pressure on vulnerable populations, is precisely the dynamic that is driving the current biodiversity crisis. The specific mechanisms differ, the scale differs, but the underlying pattern environmental change, reducing the resilience of species populations, human activity, applying additional stress that prevents recovery, is the same. We have been here before. We simply did not know it, because the first time we did not have the scientific framework to understand what was happening, and by the time we did, the evidence was buried under 10,000 years of sediment. The question of whether we were the asteroid this time, whether Homo sapiens played the role for the Pleistocene megafauna that the Chicxulub impactor played for the dinosaurs, is not one that has a clean answer. The asteroid was singular, sudden, and indiscriminate. We were none of those things. We were gradual, strategic, and selective. We targeted the largest animals, the slowest reproducers, the ones with the most to lose from even modest increases in mortality. We were not a catastrophe. We were a chronic condition. And for the ground sloth, which had endured catastrophes before and survived them, a chronic condition was something new and something fatal. Mini-documentary, The Footprints at White Sands. There is a place in southern New Mexico where the ground remembers a conversation between two species, a conversation that took place roughly 21,000 years ago and was recorded, with the fidelity of a photograph, in the mud of an ancient lakeshore. The place is White Sands National Park, and the conversation, if that is the right word for it, was between a giant ground sloth and a human being, or rather several human beings. And the topic, as near as we can determine, was the future specifically, whether the ground sloth would have one. The footprints were discovered in 2017 and formally described in the years that followed by an international team of researchers including Matthew Bennett, Sally Reynolds, David Bustos, and others. What they found was a series of fossilized tracks in the dried sediment of what was once the shore of Lake Otero, a pluvial lake that existed during wetter periods of the Pleistocene. The tracks include the large, distinctive prints of a giant ground sloth, deep, elongated impressions left by an animal of considerable weight, with visible claw marks at the front of each print, and inside those prints, smaller human footprints. The human was walking in the sloth's tracks, stepping, deliberately and precisely, into the impressions left by the much larger animal, matching its stride, following its path. The precision of this behaviour rules out coincidence. A person walking casually in the same direction as a sloth would not consistently place their feet inside the sloth's much larger prints. This was intentional. This was tracking. The human was following the sloth, and doing so in a way that minimized their own footprint, literally and perhaps figuratively, by stepping where the sloth had already compressed the mud. Whether this was a hunting strategy, a stalking technique, or simply a way of moving more easily across soft ground is debated. but the overall picture, a human following a large animal with focused, deliberate intent, is unmistakable. What makes the White Sands trackway even more extraordinary is what happens next in the sequence. At one point, the Sloth's tracks change. The stride shortens. The prints deepen on one side, suggesting the animal turned. There are what researchers have described as flailing circles, marks in the mud consistent with the sloth rearing up and swinging its forearms, possibly in a defensive display. Around this point, additional human footprints appear, approaching from different angles. The picture that emerges is one of a coordinated event, multiple humans converging on a ground sloth that has been tracked, cornered, or at least confronted, and the sloth responding with the only defense it knows standing its ground, rising to its full height and presenting those enormous claws. We do not know the outcome. The mud did not record a kill. It recorded only the approach, the confrontation, and then nothing. The tracks end. The lake dried. The mud hardened. The millennia passed, and the story, preserved in stone, waited for someone to read it. The White Sands footprints are among the oldest evidence of human presence in the Americas, and they're dating to approximately 21,000 to 23,000 years before present. Based on radiocarbon dates from seeds of the aquatic plant Rupia serosa found within the track layers, has been controversial. If confirmed, they push back the timeline of human arrival in the Americas by several thousand years and challenge the long-standing consensus about when and how people first entered the New World. But regardless of the dating debate, the tracks themselves are extraordinary. They are, in the most literal sense, a record of first contact or at least early contact between two species that had never encountered each other before and that were, in the long run, incompatible. One would persist, the other would not. And the mud at White Sands, indifferent and precise, recorded the moment when that incompatibility became physical, became spatial, became a set of footprints overlapping in the ancient dirt. There is no drama in the footprints themselves. They are just impressions in rock, shallow, eroded, easy to miss if you are not looking for them. But knowing what they represent, knowing that a human being once stood in this spot and looked up at something enormous, something that had been on this continent for millions of years and had only a few thousand left, that knowledge transforms the landscape, it transforms the silence, and it makes the flat, white expanse of the lakebed feel for a moment very crowded with the past. Chapter 6. The Climate That Shifted. Let us, for a moment, set aside the question of human agency and talk about weather. Not the weather of a single afternoon or a single season, but the weather of millennia, the slow, enormous, grinding shifts in climate that define the boundaries of epochs and reshape the face of the earth with a patience that makes even the ground sloth look hurried. Because whatever role humans played in the extinction of the Pleistocene megafauna, they did not act in a vacuum. They acted in a world that was already changing, already unstable, already in the process of becoming something fundamentally different from what it had been for the previous 100,000 years. And the change was not subtle. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, occurred roughly 26,500 to 19,000 years ago, depending on the region and the measure. During this period, enormous ice sheets covered much of northern North America and northern Europe. The Laurentide ice sheet, which blanketed Canada and the northern United States, was in places 2 to 3 miles thick, a mass of ice so heavy that it physically depressed the continental crust beneath it, an effect whose rebound is still measurable today as the land slowly, imperceptibly rises. Sea levels were roughly 120 metres, nearly 400 feet lower than they are now, exposing vast tracts of continental shelf, connecting continents and islands that are now separated by water, and creating a world that would be, to modern eyes, almost unrecognisable. South of the ice sheets, however, the picture was more complex than a simple division between frozen and not frozen. The Pleistocene was not a monolithic block of cold. It was a period of intense climatic variability, characterized by cycles of glacial advance and retreat, the Milankovitch cycles, driven by periodic variations in Earth's orbital parameters that produced alternating periods of cold glacials and warmth interglacials. During glacial periods, the climate was generally colder and drier. During interglacials, it was warmer and wetter. Vegetation zones shifted accordingly, forests advanced and retreated, grasslands expanded and contracted, desert margins fluctuated. The world was in constant slow motion, and the animals that lived in it, including the ground sloths, had to track these changes, adjusting their ranges, their diets, and their behaviours in response to the shifting mosaic of habitats. And they did. This is the part that often gets lost in discussions of the Pleistocene extinction. The ground sloths and the broader megafauna had survived dozens of these climatic cycles. The Pleistocene, spanning roughly 2.6 million years, encompassed numerous glacial-interglacial transitions, each one involving significant changes in temperature, precipitation, and habitat distribution. The ground sloths persisted through all of them. Their populations fluctuated, their ranges expanded and contracted. Some species went extinct during particularly severe periods, replaced by others that were better adapted to the new conditions. But the lineage endured. It adapted. It survived climatic changes that were, in many cases, as severe as the one that occurred at the end of the Pleistocene. This fact is perhaps the single strongest argument against a purely climate-based explanation for the extinction. If climate change alone was sufficient to kill the ground sloths, they should have died many times before. They did not. They died once, and that once happened to coincide with the arrival of humans. But let us not dismiss the climate too quickly, because the transition at the end of the Pleistocene was, in several respects, unusual. The warming that began roughly 19,000 years ago and culminated in the current interglacial, the Holocene, was not a smooth, gradual process. It was punctuated by episodes of dramatic and rapid change, the most notable of which was the younger Dryas, a sudden, severe return to near glacial conditions that lasted from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. The younger Dryas was, by the standards of geological time, shockingly abrupt. In the space of a few decades within a single human lifetime, temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. The warming trend that had been in progress for thousands of years reversed. Ice sheets that had been retreating advanced again, and then, just as abruptly, it ended. The younger Dryas terminated in a warming event that was even faster than its onset, with temperatures rising by several degrees within perhaps a decade. The transition from the younger Dryas to the Holocene was one of the most rapid climatic shifts in the recent geological record, and its effects on ecosystems were profound. For the ground sloths, the end of the Pleistocene brought a constellation of habitat changes that were, cumulatively, catastrophic. In North America, the warming climate transformed the landscape. Boreal forests that had extended far to the south during the glacial period retreated northward. Grasslands and parklands that had supported diverse megafaunal communities were replaced, in many areas, by dense, closed canopy forests that were less productive for large herbivores. In the southwest, the relatively lush, well-watered landscapes of the late Pleistocene gave way to the arid conditions that characterize the region today. Water sources dried up. The plant communities that ground sloths depended on shifted, fragmented, and in some cases disappeared. In South America, the pattern was different in its specifics but similar in its overall trajectory. Habitats changed, often rapidly, and the animals that depended on them had to adapt, relocate, or die. The key insight, and this is where the climate and human hypotheses converge rather than compete, is that climate change did not need to kill the ground sloths directly. It did not need to create conditions that were physiologically intolerable. It merely needed to create conditions that were marginal conditions under which populations were smaller, more fragmented, less resilient, and more vulnerable to additional stresses. A ground sloth population that has been reduced by habitat loss from 1,000 individuals to 100 is not yet extinct, but it is vulnerable. It is vulnerable to drought, to disease, to random demographic fluctuations, the normal run of bad luck that any small population faces, and it is vulnerable to human hunting, even at very low levels, because a population of 100 large, slow-reproducing animals cannot absorb even modest increases in adult mortality without declining further. This is the concept of the extinction vortex, a feedback loop in which small populations become progressively more vulnerable, each stress compounding the effects of the last, until the population reaches a point where recovery is no longer possible. Climate change pushed megafaunal populations into the vortex. Human hunting may have given them the final push. Neither factor alone was necessarily sufficient. Together, they were devastating. The speed of the climate transition at the end of the Pleistocene also matters in a way that is sometimes overlooked. The ground sloths had survived previous glacial-interglacial transitions, yes, but those transitions, while sometimes abrupt, occurred in a context where the animals could track the changing habitats moving north or south, upslope or downslope, following the vegetation zones that shifted with the climate. The transition at the end of the Pleistocene, particularly the rapid warming after the younger Dryas, may have been faster than the sloths could track. Their low reproductive rates, their slow population growth, their dependence on specific plant communities, all of these would have made them less capable of rapid range shifts compared to smaller, faster reproducing species. The climate was not just changing, it was changing fast. And for an animal whose evolutionary strategy was predicated on patience, on endurance, on the slow, steady accumulation of advantage over deep time, speed was the one variable it was not equipped to handle. There is a metaphor that ecologists sometimes use to describe the Pleistocene extinction, and it is apt enough to bear repeating. Imagine a tightrope walker, skilled, experienced, capable of crossing the wire under normal conditions. Now add wind. The walker can adjust, lean, compensate. The wind increases. The adjustments become more difficult, more precarious. The walker is still on the wire, but only just, and then someone bumps the platform. Not hard, just a nudge. But a nudge, applied to a system already at its limit of tolerance, is all it takes. The walker falls. The climate was the wind. Humans may have been the nudge, and the ground sloth, balanced on a tightrope it had walked for 20 million years, fell. The silence that followed was not sudden. Ecosystems do not collapse overnight, even when their keystone species disappear. The forests still stood. The grasslands still grew. The water still flowed, where it flowed at all. But something had changed. Something large and slow and essential was missing, and the world patiently, gradually, over centuries and millennia began to rearrange itself around the absence. That rearrangement is still in progress. The world is still adjusting to the loss of the ground, sloth, and the mammoth, and the mastodon, and all the others. We live in a world that is still in the process of becoming what it will be without them. And we are, whether we know it or not, part of that process. Mini-documentary, The Avocado's Missing Partner. Let us talk about avocados. Specifically, let us talk about the fact that the avocado, Persea americana, should not exist. Not in its current form, anyway. The avocado, as you encounter it in a grocery store or on a plate of toast, has a pit the size of a golf ball, surrounded by a thick layer of oily, calorie-dense flesh. The pit is too large for any bird to swallow. It is too large for any rodent to carry. It is too large, frankly, for any animal currently native to the Americas to disperse effectively. The avocado falls from its tree, lands on the ground, and in the absence of the animal it evolved to attract sits there, rotting, its seed germinating in the shadow of the parent tree, or not germinating at all. This is not a successful reproductive strategy. This is a fruit waiting for a partner that never arrives. The partner, of course, was the ground sloth, or the gompho there, or the mastodon, or any of the dozens of large herbivores that roamed the Americas during the Pleistocene, and that were perfectly capable of consuming a fruit the size of a grenade, swallowing the pit whole, carrying it in their capacious gut for hours or days, and depositing it, intact and scarified, miles from where it was eaten. The avocado's pit is not a design flaw. It is a key that no longer has a lock. It was shaped by millions of years of coevolution with animals that are now extinct, and its persistence, the fact that the avocado still produces this enormous, seemingly pointless pit, is a kind of biological memory, a record of a relationship that ended 10,000 years ago, but whose traces are still legible in the anatomy of a living fruit. Dan Jansen and Paul Martin, in their 1982 paper Neotropical Anachronisms, The Fruits the Gomphithers Ate, were the first to articulate this idea clearly. They argued that many neotropical fruits, not just avocados, but also the large fruited species of crescentia, cassia, and others were evolutionary anachronisms, their traits shaped by interactions with megafauna that no longer existed. The fruits were, in Jansen and Martin's memorable phrase, the ghosts of evolution, living relics of a vanished ecological partnership. The avocado survived the loss of its dispersers only because humans, who arrived in the Americas and eventually domesticated the plant, stepped into the role that the megafauna had vacated. We are, in effect, the avocado's replacement partner, a substitute for the ground sloth, the gomphothere, and the mastodon, doing consciously and agriculturally what those animals did instinctively and ecologically. The avocado did not evolve for us. It evolved for something much larger, much older, and much less inclined to make toast. We are a workaround, a contingency, an accident of history that happened to prevent one particular anachronism from following its partners into oblivion. But not all anachronisms were so lucky. The Osage orange, that strange, wrinkled, softball-sized fruit that litters the ground beneath Maclura pomifera trees across the American Midwest, has no domesticated saviour. It falls, it rots, it is occasionally picked up by a curious child or a squirrel that quickly loses interest. The tree persists. It was widely planted as fence rows before the invention of barbed wire, but its fruit goes largely undispersed, a green, fragrant monument to an animal that used to eat it and no longer does. The honey locust, with its long, sweet pods and its fearsome thorns, tells a similar story. So does the Kentucky coffee tree, whose heavy, hard-shelled seeds were likely designed to survive a trip through the digestive tract of something enormous. These plants are still here, their partners are not. And the gap between them, the space where a ground sloth or a mastodon used to be, is one of the quietest, most persistent legacies of the Pleistocene extinction. It is not visible in the way that a skeleton is visible. It is not dramatic in the way that a set of fossilized footprints is dramatic. It is simply an absence, a fruit that falls and is not eaten, a seed that germinates in the wrong place, a tree whose defences are aimed at a threat that vanished 10,000 years ago. It is the ghost in the garden, and it is, in its own modest way, as eloquent a testament to the ground sloth's existence as any bone or claw or tunnel carved into rock. Chapter 7. The Last Ones. There is a particular kind of sadness that attaches to the phrase, the last one. The last passenger pigeon, Martha, died in the Cincinnati Zoo on the 1st of September 1914, at 1:0 inches the afternoon. The last known thylacine, sometimes called Benjamin, though that name is probably apocryphal, died in the Beaumaris Zoo in Hobart, Tasmania, on the 7th of September 1936. The last Pinta Island tortoise, Lonesome George, died in the Galapagos on the 24th of June 2012. In each case, the death of the final individual was witnessed, recorded, and mourned, not in real time necessarily, but in retrospect, once the finality of the loss became clear. There was, at least, a moment that could be identified, a date that could be entered into the record, a story that could be told. The last ground sloth received no such dignity. It died, somewhere, at some point, and no one was watching. No one recorded the date. No one mourned. The species simply ceased to exist, and the fact of its cessation was not noticed for thousands of years until someone dug up a bone and began asking questions. But when, exactly, did the last ground sloth die? The answer depends on where you look, and it is more surprising than most people expect. On the mainland Americas, the extinction of ground sloths appears to have been largely complete by roughly 10,000 to 11,000 years before present. The radiocarbon dates on the youngest mainland ground sloth fossils cluster in this range, consistent with the broader pattern of megafaunal extinction at the end of the Pleistocene. In North America, the last Shasta ground sloths at Rampart Cave date to approximately 11,000 years ago. In South America, the last Mylodon remains from Patagonia are of similar age. The mainland extinction was, in geological terms, swift a few thousand years at most, from the first signs of decline to the final disappearance. But the islands tell a different story. On Cuba and Hispaniola, ground sloths specifically, members of the genera Megalochnus and Porochnus, small, island-adapted species that had evolved in isolation for thousands of years, persisted far longer than their mainland relatives. Radiocarbon dates on bones from Cuban cave deposits indicate that these island ground sloths survived until approximately 4,400 years before present. Some dates are slightly earlier, some slightly later, and there is the usual uncertainty associated with radiocarbon dating of very old bone, but the consensus range places the extinction of the Caribbean ground sloth somewhere around 4,400 to 4,200 years ago. Let that number sink in for a moment. 4,400 years before present. That is approximately 2,400 BCE. The Great Pyramid of Giza, the oldest and largest of the three pyramids on the Giza Plateau, was completed around 2,560 BCE. The Old Kingdom of Egypt was in full flower. Cuneiform writing had been in use in Mesopotamia for over 1,000 years. The Bronze Age was well underway in the eastern Mediterranean. The Indus Valley civilization was at its zenith. And on an island in the Caribbean, a ground sloth, the last surviving member of a lineage that stretched back 20 million years, was going about its business, eating leaves, sleeping in the shade, utterly unaware that it was the final act of an enormously long play. The late survival of ground sloths in the Caribbean is not anomalous. It fits a pattern that is visible across multiple island systems worldwide. Megafauna that went extinct on mainlands often persisted on islands for thousands of years longer, surviving until humans eventually arrived, and this phrase again, the math changed. In Madagascar, the giant lemurs, elephant birds, and pygmy hippos survived until roughly 2,000 years ago, coinciding with the arrival of human settlers. In New Zealand, the moa survived until approximately 600 years ago, when the Maori arrived and hunted them to extinction within a few centuries. The islands are natural experiments, closed systems where the variables are fewer and the outcomes are clearer. And the outcome, consistently, is that megafauna survived in the absence of humans and disappeared after humans arrived. The Caribbean ground sloths survived for roughly 6,000 years after their mainland relatives went extinct, survived through the same climatic changes, the same environmental shifts, and then disappeared within a few centuries of the first human colonization of the islands. This does not prove, with mathematical certainty, that humans caused the extinction, but it makes the alternative that the Caribbean extinctions were coincidentally timed to human arrival a position that requires considerable faith in coincidence. The idea that ground sloths were alive when the pyramids were being built is one of those facts that, once you learn it, rearranges your sense of time. We tend to think of the Pleistocene extinction as an event of the deep past, something that happened in the Ice Age, safely distant, firmly prehistoric. And for the mainland species, this is broadly true, but the Caribbean ground sloths blur that boundary. They existed within the span of recorded human history, or very nearly. They were contemporary with civilizations that produced writing, architecture, mathematics, and art. They lived in a world that was, in many respects, recognizably our own, a world with cities and trade routes and political systems, and yet they lived and died on islands where no one was writing anything down, and their passing left no trace in any human record. The distance between the pyramid builders and the last ground sloth is not a distance of time, it is a distance of attention. The two existed simultaneously. One was noticed, the other was not. And then there is the Mapinguari. In the folklore of the Amazon basin, particularly among indigenous communities in Brazil and Bolivia, there are stories of a large, foul-smelling, hairy creature that walks the forest, sometimes described as bipedal, sometimes as having one eye, sometimes as having a mouth in its belly, called the Mapinguari. The name varies by region, as do the details, but the core description, a large, ground-dwelling, herbivorous or omnivorous creature with thick skin and powerful claws, has, inevitably, attracted the attention of cryptozoologists, who have suggested that the Mapinguari might be a surviving ground sloth, persisting in the vast, poorly explored interior of the Amazon rainforest. This is, almost certainly, not the case. The Amazon basin is large, yes, and portions of it are indeed poorly explored by modern scientists. But the idea that a population of large mammals could persist undetected in the 21st century, leaving no physical evidence, no bones, no dung, no hair, no footprints, no camera trap images, strains credulity well past the breaking point. The Mapinguari legend is fascinating as folklore and potentially illuminating as a cultural memory. It is not impossible that the stories preserve some distant echo of a time when humans and ground sloths coexisted in South America, transmitted through oral tradition over hundreds of generations, distorted and embellished along the way, until the original animal is barely recognizable. But cultural memory is not the same as biological survival. The ground sloth is gone, the stories remain. And the difference between the two, between a living animal and a remembered one, is the difference we call extinction. The last ground sloth, wherever and whenever it died, died without ceremony. It did not know it was the last. It did not know that its species had existed for 20 million years, or that it had once ranged across 2 continents, or that its kind had shaped forests and dispersed seeds and dug tunnels that would outlast them by millennia. It knew, presumably, only what any animal knows: hunger, thirst, the warmth of the sun, the coolness of shade, the presence or absence of others of its kind. And at some point it knew the absence, not as a concept, not as a tragedy, but as a simple fact of its daily experience. There were fewer, and then fewer still, and then none. The last ground sloth died alone, not because solitude was its nature, but because there was no one left. And the world, which had been shaped by its presence for 20 million years, continued changed, diminished, rearranged, but continuing without it. There is no grave, there is no marker, there is no date in any calendar. There is only a gap in the fossil record, in the ecological web, in the long story of life on Earth where something used to be and no longer is. The gap has a shape, it has a weight. And if you know what to look for, you can see it everywhere, in the fruits that fall uneaten, in the tunnels that lead to empty chambers, in the silence of a Caribbean island where something large and slow once moved among the trees and left no witness to its going. Chapter 8. The Silence After. Extinction, as a concept, is easier to understand than to feel. We can grasp it intellectually: a species existed, and then it did not without necessarily apprehending its full weight. The word itself is clinical, almost bureaucratic, suggesting a process as orderly as filing a form or closing an account. Species A. Status change from extant to extinct. Please update your records accordingly, but extinction is not orderly. It is not clean. It is not a single moment, but a long, ragged process, a diminishing, a thinning, a slow withdrawal of presence from the world, measured not in years but in the gradual disappearance of sounds, of movements, of the specific quality of life that each species brings to the places it inhabits. What does it sound like when a 5-ton herbivore moves through a forest? We do not know. We can guess, extrapolating from the sounds made by elephants, the crack of branches, the low rumble of digestion, the heavy, deliberate footfalls that you feel in your chest before you hear them with your ears. But we do not know what a megatherium sounded like. We do not know if it vocalized, and if so, what frequency, what timbre, what range. We do not know if it was silent, as some large animals are, or whether it announced its presence in the way that elephants do, with infrasound that carries for miles and communicates information about identity, location, and emotional state to others of its kind. We do not know, and we will never know, because there is no recording, no memory, no oral tradition that preserves the sound of an animal that has been silent for 10,000 years. The silence is complete, and it is permanent. This is what extinction means, at the level of sensory experience. It means the loss not just of an animal, but of everything that animal contributed to the experiential fabric of the world. The way it looked against a landscape, the way it smelled in a ground sloth, given its size, its herbivorous diet, and its presumably voluminous digestive output, would have smelled considerably. The way it changed the texture of a place simply by being there, the trampled paths, the stripped branches, the wallows, the dung heaps, the subtle alteration of a forest's architecture that comes from having something enormous moving through it on a regular basis. All of that is gone, and its absence is not nothing. Its absence is a specific, measurable, ongoing alteration of the world. Ecologists have a term for this: trophic downgrading. It refers to the cascading effects that follow the removal of large animals from an ecosystem, changes in vegetation structure, in nutrient cycling, in fire regimes, in the distribution of smaller species that depended, directly or indirectly, on the presence of the megafauna. The removal of large herbivores from a landscape does not simply leave a gap. It triggers a chain reaction, a series of secondary and tertiary effects that propagate through the ecosystem like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Forests become denser. Grasslands are invaded by shrubs. Fire patterns change, because the accumulated vegetation that large herbivores would have consumed or trampled now serves as fuel. Nutrient distribution shifts, because the dung and urine of large animals, which served as mobile fertilization systems, are no longer being deposited across the landscape. The entire ecosystem reorganizes itself around the absence, and the result, the world we live in, the landscapes we take for granted, is not the original, it is the aftermath. The Americas without their megafauna are not the Americas as they were. They are the Americas as they became after the subtraction. The forests of the eastern United States, dense and closed canopy, would likely have been more open, more park-like, if mammoths and mastodons were still pushing through them, knocking down trees, creating clearings. The grasslands of the Great Plains might have a different composition, a different structure, if ground sloths and gomphithers were still grazing and browsing them. The deserts of the southwest might be less desertified or differently desertified if large herbivores were still maintaining the vegetation that held the soil in place. We cannot know for certain. We cannot run the experiment. But we can see, in the landscapes we inhabit, the traces of what was lost, the overgrown clearings, the unfruited trees, the empty niches, and we can understand, if we choose to, that the world we live in is not the world as it was designed to be. It is the world as it was left after the designers departed. There is a philosophical dimension to this that is worth sitting with, particularly at this hour, when the mind is inclined toward reflection rather than analysis. The ground sloth existed for roughly 20 million years. In that time, it watched, if watched is the right word for the passive, unconscious witnessing that any long-lived lineage performs the rise and fall of countless other species. It outlasted the terror birds of South America. It outlasted the sparacodonts, the marsupial predators that once dominated the continent. It outlasted multiple genera of saber-toothed cats. It outlasted climatic upheavals, volcanic events, the merging of continents, and the relentless churn of evolution that continually produces new forms while discarding old ones. For 20 million years the ground sloth's ticket was valid, and then, in a span of time so brief that the geological record can barely resolve it, the ticket was punched, the ride was over, and the animal that had endured everything turned out to be unable to endure us. This is not a moral judgment. Early humans in the Americas were not villains. They were people, complex, intelligent, adaptive people making survival decisions in a world that was changing around them. They hunted because they needed to eat. They used fire because it was useful. They expanded their range because that is what successful species do. They did not know, could not have known, that their actions, compounded over centuries and millennia, would contribute to the disappearance of dozens of species. They had no concept of extinction, no framework for understanding that a species could cease to exist entirely. They were, in every meaningful sense, innocent of the outcome, even as they were complicit in the process. This is not a comfortable distinction. It is, however, an honest one, and it is a distinction that resonates with our current moment. We are not innocent of the current biodiversity crisis. As early humans were innocent of the Pleistocene extinction, we have the knowledge, the data, the understanding. We know what extinction means. We know what drives it. We know which species are at risk and, in many cases, what could be done to save them. The question is not one of knowledge but of will, of whether we choose to act on what we know, or whether we allow the same dynamic that ended the ground sloth environmental change, combined with human pressure, the wind and the nudge to continue unchecked, The ground sloth cannot be saved. That moment has passed. But the lesson it offers that extinction is not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow accumulation of small losses, each one seemingly manageable. Together fatal is one that remains available to us, if we are willing to learn it. The ground sloth is gone. Its bones are in museums. Its dung is in labs. Its claw marks are in the walls of tunnels that no one uses. Its DNA has been sequenced. Its diet has been reconstructed. Its range has been mapped. Its extinction has been debated and analysed and modelled and discussed in thousands of papers and conferences and late-night conversations between people who care about such things. We know more about the ground sloth now than anyone has known since the last human being to see one alive. Some anonymous hunter or gatherer on a Caribbean island, roughly 4,400 years ago, who looked at the animal with whatever mix of familiarity and indifference one feels toward a creature that has always been part of the landscape, and who had no way of knowing that the landscape was about to change. What does it mean to remember an animal that has been gone for 10,000 years? It means reconstructing, from fragments, a creature that was once whole. It means holding a piece of fossilized dung and understanding that it represents a meal, and that the meal represents a life, and that the life represents a species, and that the species represents a lineage stretching back to the Oligocene. It means standing in a Brazilian tunnel, running your hand along grooves cut by claws that no longer exist, and feeling the weight of the animal's absence as a physical thing, a heaviness in the air, a silence that is not empty but full of everything that used to be here and is not. The ground sloth endured for 20 million years. We have been studying it for roughly 200. In that time we have learned an extraordinary amount, enough to reconstruct its anatomy, its ecology, its behaviour, its diet, its evolutionary history, and the probable causes of its extinction with a degree of detail that would have astonished Darwin, who held its bones and wondered. But we have not learned everything. We have not learned what it sounded like, or how it smelled, or what it felt like to stand in a Pleistocene forest and watch one move through the trees. We have not learned whether it was solitary or social, curious or wary, gentle or indifferent. We have its bones but not its behaviour, its dung but not its voice, its claws but not the motion of its limbs. The reconstruction is detailed, meticulous, and incomplete, a portrait painted from evidence, with all the gaps that evidence cannot fill, and perhaps that incompleteness is the most honest thing about it. We cannot fully know what we have lost, because what we lost was not just an animal, but a presence, a specific way of being alive in a specific set of landscapes, interacting with a specific web of other species, contributing to a specific set of ecological processes that no longer function as they once did. The loss is real, and it is ongoing, and it is felt in ways that are sometimes subtle and sometimes not subtle at all. The avocado tree drops its fruit and waits. The tunnel in the Brazilian hillside stands open and empty. The Caribbean island is quiet. And somewhere in the sediment, in the layered record of the earth, the bones of the last ground sloth lie where they fell, unmarked and unremarked, holding the shape of something that was once alive and is now a fact of geology rather than a fact of biology. Closing. So here we are, at the end of a story that spans 20 million years and arrives, as all such stories must, at silence. The giant ground sloth, Megatherium, Erymatherium, Mylodon, Nothrotheriops, Megalonyx, and all their kin is gone. Gone from the pampas of Argentina and the caves of Patagonia. Gone from the canyons of the American Southwest and the flatlands of Florida. Gone from the islands of the Caribbean, where the last of them held on for thousands of years past the deadline, like guests at a party who did not realize the host had left. They are gone, and in their place there is a world that has adjusted to their absence the way a body adjusts to a missing limb, compensating, rerouting, continuing, but never quite the same. What the ground sloth teaches us, if we are willing to sit with the lesson, is that extinction is not a failure of the extinct. The ground sloth did not fail. It succeeded magnificently and for an almost incomprehensible duration at the fundamental task of being alive. It found food, avoided predators, reproduced, and passed its genes forward through geological epochs that saw the rise and fall of entire ecosystems. It shaped the world it lived in literally, physically, ecologically in ways that are still visible 10,000 years after its departure. It was not fragile, it was not maladapted, it was not by any meaningful measure unfit. It was simply, in the end, unable to withstand the particular combination of pressures that converged upon it in the final millennia of the Pleistocene, a warming climate, a fragmenting habitat, and a new predator that it had no evolutionary preparation for and no effective defense against. The ground sloth did everything right for 20 million years, and then the rules changed all at once, and doing everything right was no longer enough. There is a question that hovers over all of this, unspoken but persistent, and it is a question not about the ground sloth but about us. What do we owe to the species we share the planet with? What do we owe to the ones we have already lost? The ground sloth cannot answer this question. It never could. It was an animal, not a philosopher, and its concerns were the concerns of any living creature, food, shelter, the continuation of its kind. But the question persists, because we are the ones asking it, and we are the ones whose answer matters. We are the species that inherited a world shaped by megafauna, and then, whether by action or by inaction, allowed that megafauna to disappear. We are the species that dug up the bones and pieced together the story and felt, for the first time in the history of the planet, something like grief for an animal we never knew. We are the species that can look at a fossil and see not just a rock but a life, not just a specimen but a loss, not just data but a debt, whether we choose to pay that debt through conservation, through restraint, through the simple act of remembering what was here before us, is perhaps the most important question the ground sloth story leaves behind. Bone does not remember. Bone does not grieve. Bone does not know that it once supported the weight of something that mattered. Bone simply remains calcium and phosphorus, crystallized and compressed, holding the shape of a life that ended and a world that moved on. But we remember. Imperfectly, incompletely, and always too late, but we remember. And in that remembering, in the act of sitting with the bones and the dung and the claw marks and the silence, and allowing ourselves to feel the weight of what is no longer here, there is something that might, if we are generous with ourselves, be called reverence. Not worship, not sentimentality, just the quiet recognition that something enormous once stood in this exact spot on the earth, and breathed, and moved, and lived, and then was gone, and that its absence still has weight, still has shape, still has a voice, if only we are quiet enough to hear it. The ground sloth moved slowly, it lived patiently, and it disappeared so gradually that the world did not notice until the silence was the only sound left. Tonight, in that silence, we listened. And for a little while, the distance between now and the Pleistocene was not as vast as it seemed, and something ancient, something enormous, something long gone, felt very nearly close enough to touch. Rest well. The bones will keep until morning.